The winter of 1842 had pressed its weight upon the valley with such cruelty that even the bells of St. Bartholomew's seemed muted, their iron tongues reluctant to stir in the brittle air. The town of Wexford, huddled beneath the frost-bitten shoulders of the Pennine Hills, was accustomed to hardship, but that year the silence was heavier than mere weather. It was a silence broken only once by the sound of a scream that no one claimed to hear, and no one dared admit they ignored. It was not the scream itself that would mark the beginning of the story, but rather what followed the next morning. At dawn, Brother Clement, the monastery's aging groundskeeper, walked his usual path between the outer gate and the seminary's frozen well. His lantern sputtered in the wind, throwing jagged shadows against the snow. He knew every stone, every timber, every ritual of the place. Yet that morning, something was wrong. Near the well, his boot struck an object half buried in the frost. He thought it at first a bundle of rags, discarded by one of the boys. But when he stooped, the lantern glow revealed pale fingers, stiffened by the night, curled as though still clawing at the air. The body was that of a novice, no more than 14 years of age, face bruised and lips cracked blue from the cold. A rosary was tangled around his neck, its beads pressed so deeply into the flesh that they seemed carved there. His eyes were open, fixed not at the heavens, but at the ground, as if expecting something to rise from beneath the earth. Clement staggered back, muttering a prayer half forgotten in his panic. He dropped the lantern, which hissed as it met the snow, and with trembling hands attempted to lift the boy. The child was lighter than expected, bones pressing sharp through his cassock. Clement whispered the boy's name, though none came to his lips. The face was unfamiliar, as though this child had been plucked from nowhere and left here at their gate. Word spread by mid-morning. The seminary bell tolled not for mass, but for death, and the sound dragged townsfolk from their hearths toward the gates. They came in clusters, breath pluming in the frozen air, speaking in low tones that carried more speculation than grief. "It's a warning," one farmer said, tightening his cloak. "The Lord's wrath." Or the devil's others whispered of hunger, of children wandering in the night to steal bread. But no one recognized the boy. His face carried no trace of the families in Wexford. He was a stranger, and yet dressed as one of their own novices. The priests emerged slowly from the cloister, their black robes fluttering in the cutting wind. Father Rector Marlowe, tall and severe, took one long look at the body before commanding it be taken inside. No prayer, no last rites spoken. Simply an order, given as one might command a door to be closed. Clement obeyed, dragging the small body across the snow, while the villagers watched in silence. Only one of them, Mrs. Hartwell, the butcher's widow, crossed herself, whispering that no child should be left unblessed. She was quickly hushed by her neighbors. The seminary's business, after all, was not to be questioned. As the doors of the seminary slammed shut, a strange sound echoed faintly through the courtyard. Some swore it was the groan of the hinges. Others insisted it was something else, a low, hollow chant, as though the stone walls themselves exhaled in relief. That evening, the snow fell harder. The villagers returned to their homes, shutters drawn tight. But behind every hearth fire, behind every whispered grace at the supper table, lingered the image of the boy's eyes, wide, unblinking, and turned forever downward. By midnight, a rumor had already taken shape. The boy, some said, was not the first. And within the seminary, where candlelight trembled against cold stone, the priests gathered not in prayer, but in silence, as though every word they might have spoken was a confession too dangerous to utter. By the third day after the boy's discovery, the town of Wexford had wrapped itself in a veil of half-truths and speculation. In the tavern by the bridge, men hunched over their mugs, their talk pitched just low enough that outsiders could not hear. In the milliner's shop, women pretended to inspect lace, while their voices trembled with rumors of what the priests had hidden inside the seminary's walls. The official account, pinned hastily to the church door on the 15th of January, 1842, declared the death an unfortunate case of exposure. No name was given for the child. The notice claimed he had wandered from a nearby village and perished in the cold before reaching sanctuary. Yet the wording was starkly unconvincing. No parish mentioned, no family identified, no priest signing the statement. Only the wax seal of Rector Marlowe, pressed into the paper, blurred as though done in haste. Some villagers accepted it at face value. The winter had been brutal. It was no stretch to imagine a child lost to the snow. But others found themselves unable to sleep, haunted not by grief, but by unease. If the boy truly had come from another village, why had no one claimed him? And why had his death been met not with the toll of mourning bells, but with silence, broken only by the hurried shuffle of priests carrying him away? At the grocer's, an elderly man named Jonas Cobb spoke of a strange sight from the previous autumn. "I was on the North Road, in October," he muttered, while weighing sugar. "Saw 2 priests walking after dusk, leading 3 boys I did not know. Thin lads, all of them, and one had chains at his wrists. Thought I imagined it, for the light was poor. But now—" His voice broke off, and he would say no more. Others whispered of sounds at night. Brother Clement's niece, who lived on the town's edge, swore she had heard chanting carried on the wind when the moon was low. "Not hymns," she insisted to her mother. "Not Latin either." It was like groaning or lessons repeated. Her mother struck her across the mouth for saying so, warning that to accuse the clergy was to invite damnation. Still, the girl did not retract her words. The butcher's widow, Mrs. Hartwell, gathered fragments of gossip like a ledger of unspoken fears. She noted that the seminary had taken fewer students in recent years. She observed that the gates remained barred even during festival days, when in earlier times the boys had marched into town to sing hymns and collect alms. And she whispered, too softly for all but a few to hear, that the ledger of baptisms had gaps where names should have been written. One evening, in the tavern's back corner, a travelling peddler produced a folded scrap of newspaper, dated November 1841, from as far away as Durham. The piece reported the unexplained disappearance of 2 orphans en route to a northern seminary. Their escort, a cleric named in the article, had denied responsibility, claiming the boys never arrived. The peddler traced his finger across the faded type and raised his eyebrows, leaving the men at the table to draw their own conclusions. By now, the town was divided. Some argued that to question the seminary was to strike at the heart of their faith. Others muttered that faith without truth was hollow. Families began drawing their children closer at dusk, forbidding them to wander near the stone walls of St. Bartholomew's. A farmer who lived half a mile from the gates nailed his shutters shut, though he confessed to no one the reason, that he had seen candlelight in the upper windows long past the hour when even prayer should have ceased. Fear does not always roar. Often it seeps, quiet and unrelenting. In Wexford that winter, it drifted like smoke beneath every doorframe, carrying with it the same unanswered question. Who was the boy? The priests spoke not at all. Their sermons shortened, their confessions fewer, their faces pale as parchment. Rector Marlowe, when pressed by the magistrate, answered only with scripture. The wages of sin is death. The magistrate, unwilling to cross the church, recorded nothing further. Yet in the parish archive, bound in leather, and inked in a neat but trembling hand, a curious entry was made on the 16th of January, 1842. Unidentified youth, found upon the ground of the well. No family, no origin, no claim. Entry sealed at rector's order, no other detail was written. Only a symbol appeared beside it, carved deep into the page, a crude cross flanked by two parallel lines. Few would see that entry. Fewer still would understand its meaning. But those who did, those who remembered, would never again pass the seminary walls without quickening their step. And still the whisper remained, growing louder with every retelling. This was not the first child, and it will not be the last. The seminary of St. Bartholomew's had always loomed like a fortress above Wexford, its grey stone walls built in 1798 upon the ruins of a burned manor. It was less than a mile from the village square, yet to most it felt as distant as another country. Few townsfolk had crossed its gates in living memory. Those who did spoke of narrow corridors, dim as cellars, and classrooms lined with crucifixes, whose painted eyes seemed to follow the boys wherever they moved. The priests called it a place of discipline, a crucible for faith. But discipline, as whispered among the townsfolk, often carried another name: punishment. Inside, the novices lived in silence, broken only by lessons, hymns, and the occasional thud of a cane against a desk. Their day began at 4 a.m., when the bell summoned them from their straw pallets to kneel upon the stone floor for morning prayers. Meals were thin: bread, broth, and watered ale, and conversation forbidden. Punishments, according to one former novice, whose testimony survives in an 1845 deposition, were inflicted not with hands alone, but with instruments of iron, devised to correct the spirit. The priests themselves were a closed brotherhood, though among them certain figures stood apart. Rector Marlowe, gaunt and cold-eyed, had held his position since 1826. Father Greer, younger, pale-haired, was said to favour long hours in the archives, copying manuscripts whose language no one else could read. And Brother Anselm, once a soldier in the Peninsular Wars, walked with a limp and carried keys at his belt that jingled with every step. Children in the town had long whispered that each key opened a chamber no one dared enter. From within the seminary's own records, a logbook later unearthed during the parish's reorganization in 1871, entries describe corrections administered without naming the recipients. One notation, dated 3rd March 1840, reads simply, 3 days confinement without speech. Iron taught what words would not. Another, 21st July 1841, records, the rector commends the endurance of the novices. The discipline strengthens resolve. Pain is prayer. The townspeople, of course, never saw these words, but traces of the seminary's inner life reached them in subtler ways. Now and again, A boy was seen outside the gates, sent on errands for candles or ink. They rarely spoke, but their silence was not that of obedience. It was the silence of fear, their eyes darting at every question. One shopkeeper recalled a boy of perhaps 13 who came to purchase twine in autumn 1841. When asked his name, he hesitated, as though unsure he had one at all. Instead, he lifted his sleeve to count coins, revealing scars like narrow ridges across his wrist. The shopkeeper said nothing at the time. He only remembered it later, after the body at the well. Within the seminary walls, a ritual was spoken of only in fragments. Some villagers called it the night lessons. Others swore that in winter months, lights could be seen in the crypt beneath the chapel, long after Compline had ended. A mason who worked repairs on the roof in 1839 claimed to have seen boys led into that crypt at dusk, each carrying a candle and a heavy book bound in black leather. What they recited there he could not say, but the sound, he insisted until his death, was not prayer, but groaning in unison, as if pain itself were the liturgy. The seminary maintained strict control over its image. Annual reports to the diocese praised the flourishing of devotion and the sharpening of minds through rigorous training. Yet in the margins of one such report, an anonymous hand had scrawled, "What flourishes here is silence, and silence hides much." When the unidentified boy was found in January 1842, no novice was seen in the town for weeks afterward. The seminary gates remained locked, the windows shuttered. Inside, the priests moved with even greater secrecy. The only sounds to escape were the tolling of the bell at unusual hours, midnight, sometimes later, followed by an eerie hush that seemed to spread across the valley like a shroud. Some in Wexford began to wonder if the seminary was not merely teaching faith, but experimenting with something else entirely, testing the body as one might test iron, forging endurance through suffering. The notion was rarely spoken aloud, but once conceived, it took root. For what else could explain the bruises glimpsed, the vacant stares, the child at the well with rosary beads carved into his skin? By the end of that winter, one truth had become certain. The priests of St. Bartholomew's were not merely guardians of Scripture. They were keepers of something darker, a discipline not written in holy books but in flesh and bone. And if the community could not name it, they could feel it pressing against them still, an unspoken weight, as though the valley itself carried the memory of pain. On the night of 27th February, 1842, the ordinary rhythm of Wexford was broken by something so disquieting that even those who claimed steadfast faith found themselves unable to speak of it plainly. The event began, curiously, not with sound, but with silence, the kind of silence that falls when every living creature senses something has gone awry. The village had gathered for Sunday Vespers at St. Jude's, the parish church that stood a mere half-mile from the seminary gates. The snow had begun to thaw, trickling in narrow streams down the cobbled lanes, and the pews were damp with the weight of heavy coats and boots. The service proceeded as usual, until the moment came for the novices of St. Bartholomew's to sing the evening hymn. 7 boys entered the nave, each dressed in the black cassocks of the seminary. Their faces were pale, their eyes downcast. Rector Marlowe stood at their head, silent as stone. When the hymn began, the voices that rose did not sound like the pure treble of youth. Instead, they emerged in a low, strained monotone, each syllable drawn out as if pulled against the will of the speaker. The congregation shifted uneasily. The sound was neither song nor chant, but something between, a droning rhythm that seemed to cling to the very beams of the church. By the second verse, one boy faltered, clutching his throat as though strangled by an unseen hand. His cassock swayed, and he collapsed against the stone floor. Panic rippled through the pews, though Marlowe did not move. Instead, he raised a hand, commanding silence. The other boys continued to sing, if such a sound could be called song, while their fallen companion writhed, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. Witnesses later described the sight with chilling consistency. The boys' lips moving in rhythm with the hymn, though no sound escaped them, as if some force compelled his mouth to follow the others. The service was abandoned in disarray. Families pulled their children close, rushing into the freezing night rather than remain within walls that echoed with such unnatural tones. Only the magistrate, Mr. Ellicott, attempted order, demanding the boy be taken to the infirmary. But Marlowe refused, declaring it a test of endurance, not an ailment. His words, recorded in Ellicott's later deposition, struck fear more than reassurance. The boy, identified in the seminary roll as Thomas Alder, age 15, was carried back behind the cloister gates. He was not seen again in Wexford. No burial notice was posted. What deepened the unease were the accounts of sound that lingered even after the congregation fled. Several villagers, including Mrs. Hartwell, swore that the droning hymn followed them into the night, echoing faintly, though the church lay behind them. One farmer, who lived 2 fields away, wrote in his diary that for him resounded as though sung from the ground itself, beneath the frozen soil. His diary, dated 28th February 1842, is preserved still in the county archive. The ink faded, but legible. Attempts to rationalize the event were unconvincing. The town physician claimed it a seizure, worsened by fasting and cold. A schoolteacher suggested mass hysteria, the imagination of a frightened crowd. Yet neither could explain why the voices of the remaining boys had dropped into that strange, unearthly register, or why Rector Marlowe had called it a test rather than an affliction. What lingered most in memory, however, was not the boy's collapse, nor the rector's words, but a single object later found beneath the pew where Alder had fallen. It was a slip of paper, folded twice and smeared with wax. Written in cramped Latin, the note read, "Dolor est oratio." Pain is prayer. No one claimed authorship. No one admitted to seeing it fall. Yet the words matched exactly the phrasing found in the seminary's own logbook 2 years prior. By early March, the village no longer spoke of whether the seminary was harsh or strict. They spoke, instead, of whether the seminary was touched by something beyond the natural order, something neither faith nor reason could neatly contain. And while officials urged calm, another entry appeared in the parish death registry on the 2nd of March, 1842, written in the same neat hand as before. Thomas Alder, novice, cause withheld at rector's order, entry sealed. The seal bore the same crude cross with parallel lines that had marked the unknown boy in January. The town, once merely suspicious, now lived in quiet terror. For whatever St. Bartholomew's was teaching, it seemed no longer bound to prayer or scripture. It had begun to manifest in ways no priest, no physician, and no witness could claim to understand. By the arrival of spring in March 1842, Wexford was no longer merely uneasy. It was fractured. Fear had moved from whispers to open caution. Children were forbidden to walk the lanes alone. Farmers crossed themselves when passing the seminary gates, even those who had once mocked such gestures as superstition. The collapse of young Thomas Alder during Vespers had left an imprint the town could not shake. Weeks passed, yet the sound of that unnatural hymn was spoken of as if it still lingered in the rafters of St. Jude's. In the tavern, a blacksmith insisted he woke each night at the same hour, 12:15 a.m., to hear a faint droning carried by the wind. His wife confirmed she heard nothing, but neighbors quietly admitted they had too. One man, a cooper named Henry Dale, resolved to confront the matter directly. On the night of 10th March, he stationed himself near the seminary's northern wall, where the shadows of the chapel windows stretched longest across the snow. His journal, recovered after his death, records, "At the hour of 12, the bell sounded once, though no service was due." Within moments, a light flickered in the lower crypt. Shadows of boys moved, their heads bowed. At intervals they raised their arms, as if striking or being struck, yet no voice was heard, only the scrape of stone. I confess I trembled Dale never showed this entry to the magistrate. Instead, he told only his wife, who begged him to leave the matter alone. He did not. 2 nights later, he returned. That morning, his boots were found by the north wall, standing upright as if he had stepped out of them. His body was never recovered. The magistrate, under pressure from townsfolk, filed a brief report on the 14th of March, 1842, citing Dale as missing, presumed lost to exposure. The phrasing echoed the earlier account of the unidentified boy. Few believed it. Behind closed doors, people muttered that the seminary had claimed another. Fear spread quickly after Dale's disappearance. Shopkeepers locked their doors before dusk. Farmers carried lanterns even on moonlit nights. A group of mothers formed a rota, ensuring no child fetched water from the well alone. Yet amid the fear, some began to voice anger. "If the law will not act," one man spat in the tavern, "then we must." His words were met with silence, for none dared defy the priests openly. Yet one attempt was made. On the 20th of March, small group of townsmen, 3 in number, petitioned the diocese at Lancaster, 18 miles away, demanding inquiry into St. Bartholomew's practices. The record of their petition survives, its language careful yet firm. We fear that undue severity is practiced within the seminary, such as may endanger the lives of novices entrusted there. We ask humbly that oversight be granted, lest further harm befall. The response, dated 27th March, was terse. The matter is spiritual, not civil. Rectors hold authority in discipline. The diocese sees no cause for intrusion. The letter bore the Archbishop's seal. With that, the matter was closed, officially, if not in the minds of Wexford's residents. Tension reached a breaking point at the end of the month. On the evening of the 30th of March, as the townsfolk gathered for a market fair, a girl of 11 disappeared. Her name was Mary Cobb, niece to the grocer, who had once spoken of priests leading chained boys. She had wandered from her mother's side near the candle stall. When her absence was noticed, panic erupted. Dozens searched the square, the lanes, the fields. She was found at dawn the next day, standing barefoot at the seminary gates. She was alive, but silent. Her dress was torn, her feet raw from frost. When her mother rushed to embrace her, the girl recoiled violently, covering her ears as those deafened by some sound no one else could hear. Witnesses noted that around her neck hung a piece of twine, threaded through 3 blackened rosary beads. No one claimed responsibility. No priest admitted she had been within their walls. Mary never spoke again. Her family moved away that summer, leaving behind their shop, their home, and the unspoken terror of what she had endured. The beads, however, remained. They were kept by the magistrate as evidence, but were later lost, their whereabouts unrecorded after 1846. By April, the town was suffocating under dread. Those who once dismissed rumors now avoided the seminary at all costs. And yet, the gates remained closed, the walls unbreached, and the priests untouched by any hand of justice. The people of Wexford began to ask themselves a question none had dared before. If the church itself refused to intervene, was the evil they feared not confined to stone walls at all, but sanctioned by higher authority? It was not until the summer of 1842 that new light fell upon the mysteries of St. Bartholomew's. By then, the fear that had gripped Wexford for months seemed to settle into a grim acceptance. People avoided the seminary and spoke little of its priests. Yet in the stillness, fragments of the past began to resurface, clues long buried, documents overlooked, confessions whispered only when death drew near. The first came from an unlikely source. In June 1842, the parish sexton was ordered to clear a storage loft above St. Jude's Church, where dust and mildew had claimed papers decades old. Among them he found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, their ink faded, but legible. They were dated between 1799 and 1802, the earliest years of the seminary's founding. The correspondence was between the first rector, Father Elias Worthing, and a physician in York. One letter, now held in the county archive, reads, "The boys endure as expected, though many faint in the first trial." The method of striking nerve over flesh produces most satisfactory resolve. As you wrote, pain sharpens memory. Scripture retained in such fashion does not fade. We proceed as instructed. The language was clinical, stripped of humanity. The implication that the seminary had from its inception practiced a pedagogy of torment was unmistakable. Around the same time, another record emerged. A solicitor named James Penbury, reviewing estate papers for a Wexford family, uncovered an indenture dated 1817, binding 2 orphaned brothers into service at St. Bartholomew's. The contract bore not only the rector's signature, but also a clause written in unusual Latin. Servitus per disciplina. Service through discipline. The brothers' names, Caleb and Isaac Hollin, appear in no baptismal or burial registers thereafter. They simply vanish from the parish record as though consumed by the seminary walls. Perhaps the most haunting discovery came from a confessional note recorded by a local curate in 1829. The curate, writing in a private diary, described a conversation with a novice who had fled the seminary only to return days later, starved and half-mad. The boy's words, translated from his stammer, were preserved in the curate's hand. "They say we are vessels. They say pain empties what is ours and fills us with God. But I saw nothing of God in the dark, only faces watching. Only the rod that sang like iron, the boy's identity, was never revealed, nor was his fate." When these fragments began to circulate, letters, indenture, confessional notes, they were received with both disbelief and resignation. Some dismissed them as fabrications, too perfectly damning. Others whispered that the documents only confirmed what the valley already felt in its bones. What gave these clues greater weight was the discovery of a ledger in the parish archive, misfiled among tithing accounts. It bore the year 1831 and listed expenses from St. Bartholomew's, candles, quills, bread, and an entry that unsettled even the archivist who copied it decades later. 3 instruments of restraint, wrought by Smiths at Lancaster, delivered 14th of May. No description of the instruments survives, only the expense line. But coupled with the physician's letters, the meaning was plain enough. The most disturbing of all, however, was an account not written but spoken. In July 1842, on his deathbed, Brother Clement, the groundskeeper who had first discovered the body at the well, confided to his niece that what he found that morning had not been chance. The boy, he said, had not wandered, but been left deliberately. To see if the world would notice, Clement claimed that the priests had argued the night before, their voices rising in the cloister, and that one said, "If they will not heed sermons, let them heed a corpse." The niece, horrified, repeated the confession only years later. When the last of the seminary's founders had already gone to their graves. By then, few were left who remembered, and fewer still who wished to stir old terrors. Together, these fragments form no single picture, only a mosaic of horror glimpsed through cracks. The seminary's defenders maintained discipline was necessary, that rumors were exaggerated by fear. Yet the accumulation of letters, contracts, diaries, and confessions suggested something darker. That pain itself had been elevated to doctrine, a perverse liturgy hidden beneath the guise of prayer. By the end of that summer, Wexford's people understood the truth not as fact, but as weight, an inheritance pressing down from the past. Children no longer played near the gates. Families who could afford to leave did so, their cottages standing empty along the lane. And those who remained kept their silence, as though words themselves might awaken what the seminary still concealed. The final breaking of Wexford's silence came not through rumor, nor through document, but through an event so stark that even the most devout could no longer explain it away. It occurred on the evening of All Hallows' Eve, 31st October 1842, a night already freighted with superstition, when the boundary between sacred and profane seemed thin. The seminary bell tolled at dusk, not once but 13 times. No pattern in the liturgy required it. The sound carried across the valley, heavy and uneven, as if struck by an unsteady hand. Villagers stepped from their cottages to listen. Some crossed themselves, others, remembering what had passed in February and March, barred their shutters. Shortly before midnight, flames were seen in the upper windows of St. Bartholomew's Chapel. The fire was not of destruction, but of ritual, candlelight arranged in shapes that glowed against the panes. Several witnesses described them as crosses inverted, others as wheels of spokes, turning though the glass remained still. It was then that a sound rose from the seminary walls, not the solemn chant of monks, nor the droning hymn of boys, but something fractured, layered, and strange, voices overlapping, some high, some guttural, each repeating the same phrase in Latin, dolor est oratio. Pain is prayer. The sound was carried on the wind so strongly that even families 3 miles distant, near the river bend, later claimed to have heard it. In the village square, a small crowd gathered despite the hour. Among them was Magistrate Ellicott, who had long defended restraint in judgment. But when the sound reached its peak, a cacophony that seemed less sung than screamed, he swore aloud that something must be done. He ordered the gates of the seminary approached. A group of men followed him up the lane. Lanterns in hand, they reached the iron gates just as the voices fell silent. The chapel doors swung open, though no hand was visible. Out from the shadows came the novices, 6 of them, barefoot in the frost, their cassocks torn. Each carried in his hand an object, a whip, a rod, a strip of iron chain. Their faces were expressionless, eyes glassy, as if they were sleepwalkers enacting some script older than themselves. Behind them, Rector Marlowe appeared. Witnesses recalled his words with eerie precision, for he spoke not as a man, but as if reciting a verdict. This is the last trial. The body yields, but the spirit is infinite. Then, without warning, the boys began to strike themselves, backs, arms, even faces, until the snow beneath their feet was stained. The magistrate shouted for them to stop, rushing forward with the others. But the moment a hand reached for the boys, the candles inside the chapel extinguished at once, plunging the grounds into darkness. When light was restored, lanterns fumbling, flames rekindled, the novices were gone. Only Marlowe remained, standing motionless at the chapel door. His cassock was untouched, his hands folded as though in prayer. The magistrate demanded the boys' whereabouts. Marlowe gave no answer. He only repeated, "The spirit is infinite." By dawn, the chapel was searched. No boys were found. Their pallets lay empty, their clothing folded neatly at the foot of each bed. The registers of the seminary, examined by Ellicott himself, contained no names for them at all. 6 lines had been inked over, blackened so heavily the paper tore. The magistrate's official report, filed 2nd November 1842, survives in the county archive. Its language is restrained, yet beneath it lies panic. 6 youths, names withheld, are absent from St. Bartholomew's, following a night service of unknown nature. Rector Marlowe, uncooperative. No remains recovered. Gates remain sealed. Recommend further inquiry by ecclesiastical authority. No such inquiry followed. The diocese, when pressed, issued a single statement. Records of the Wexford Seminary are incomplete. God alone judges discipline. The villagers, however, knew what they had seen. For months afterward, mothers refused to allow their sons near the church. The market emptied earlier each day. Some families abandoned Wexford entirely, their cottages falling into ruin along the lane to the hills. But perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from a single artifact preserved by Mrs. Hartwell, the butcher's widow. She claimed that on the morning after All Hallows, while collecting kindling near the seminary wall, she found a scrap of parchment half burned, as if cast from the chapel fire. On it was a line written in Latin, faint but legible. Ex corporibus fit templum. From bodies a temple is made. The parchment remains in her family's possession, though seldom shown. What became of the 6 novices is not recorded. Some say they fled, lost to the Moors. Others insist their absence was final, that the seminary had consumed them as surely as the earth consumes the dead. What is certain is that after that night, St. Bartholomew's never again sent boys to vespers at St. Jude's. Its gates stayed closed, its bells rarely tolled, and its presence became less an institution than a shadow, a monument to silence, dread, and unanswered questions. In the months following, the vanished novices of 31st October 1842, Wexford learned the art of silence. Life resumed in the outward sense. Markets reopened, harvests were gathered, and marriages were announced from the church steps. But beneath the rhythm of daily existence lay a wound unhealed, a terror unspoken. The seminary still stood, its walls unbreached, yet its presence was felt less as a school, and more as a tombstone over hidden things. The magistrate, Ellicott, filed no further reports. His last entry, dated December 12, 1842, was brief and oddly final. The matter cannot be advanced, no records supplied, no witnesses come forward. Affairs must remain with the diocese. I have done what I could. Thereafter, Ellicott withdrew from public life. By the following year, he had resigned, moving to relatives in Leeds. In his absence, no official dared reopen the case. The diocese, true to its word, buried the matter in bureaucracy. The registry of Wexford Parish shows 6 consecutive blank entries between October and December 1842, lines left unfilled as if awaiting names that never arrived. When questioned decades later, a diocesan clerk admitted the gaps were peculiar, but offered no explanation. Yet not all traces vanished. In 1845, a stonemason repairing the outer wall of the seminary discovered a cavity behind a loosened block. Inside was a small wooden box, sealed with wax. Within lay scraps of parchment covered in a hand, both hurried and uneven. One fragment read, "They are not taught. They are broken and remade. We are told pain opens the door. But what enters is not grace." The stonemason, unsettled, turned the box over to the parish vicar, who in turn forwarded it to Lancaster. There the trail ends. The box was never logged among diocesan archives, and no further record survives. In oral tradition, the story endured. Elders of Wexford, when asked in later years, spoke not of specifics, but of avoidance. They told children never to linger near the seminary's walls after dusk. They covered mirrors in their homes during winter months, muttering that reflections were untrustworthy since the night the novices disappeared. And every 31st of October they doused their fires early, as if darkness itself were safer than light. By the 1850s, the seminary still functioned, though its numbers dwindled. No longer were boys seen at markets or fairs. When asked how many students remained, priests offered evasive replies. In 1861, a census taker listed only 3 residents under the age of 20 within its walls. 2 decades later, the building stood nearly empty, manned by aging clerics and guarded by locked gates. The structure itself endured until 1894, when a lightning strike set fire to the roof. The blaze gutted the chapel, leaving the stone shell that still stands today, ivy-covered and abandoned. Locals watched as the flames rose that night, and some swore they heard voices carried on the smoke, low, overlapping chants repeating a phrase long dreaded, "Dolor est oratio." What remains now are fragments, letters in county archives, parish gaps in the record, diary entries fading to brown, and stories passed in whispers by those who never trusted the silence. The 6 novices of 1842 were never seen again, their names never restored to any ledger. The rosary beads once found around Mary Cobb's neck disappeared from evidence, as did the box of parchment, each artifact lost or concealed, as though history itself conspired to keep the truth beyond reach. Yet one detail endures with a weight more chilling than fire, loss, or rumor. The wall of the old seminary, blackened by smoke, bears a faint carving still visible in winter sunlight, a cross flanked by 2 parallel lines, the same symbol that marked the parish death records of the unidentified boy and of Thomas Alder, whether carved by stoneworker, priest, or novice. No one can say, but it remains, an emblem that neither weather nor time has erased. And so Wexford continues, its cottages repaired, its fields ploughed. Tourists pass the ruined seminary without pause, seeing only a relic of another century. But the valley remembers, for within its silence lies the knowledge that some lessons are not written in books, but in flesh, that some schools do not teach prayer, but something far darker. Even now, the unanswered questions remain. Who was the boy first found at the well? What became of the 6 who vanished into darkness? And what doctrine was truly practiced behind the stone walls of St. Bartholomew's? The records will never say, the officials will never confess, and the valley will never forget. If you want more haunting investigations into forgotten corners of history, where truth and terror are never far apart, subscribe for more explorations of history's darkest mysteries. By the late 19th century, the history of St. Bartholomew's had become more absence than record, more rumour than report. The seminary stood in half ruin, its chapel roof gone, its cloisters filled with nettles and damp. Yet the silence around it was not accidental. It was cultivated, deliberately shaped by those who had both the authority and the will to decide what should be remembered and what should not. In 1873, during a diocesan reorganization, officials compiled a fresh index of parish institutions. The entry for Wexford's seminary was one line only: closed in spirit, awaiting reform. No mention of the vanished novices, no hint of the scandals whispered in taverns. The archive. Copy remains in Lancaster, its ink steady, its omissions glaring. Around the same time, a historian named Dr. Ambrose Lyle, researching religious education in northern England, visited Wexford. His private notes, preserved in the Bodleian Library, record a conversation with an elderly villager who remembered the winter of 1842. The villager refused to speak in detail, but ended with a remark that Lyle underlined twice. The priests never feared the devil. They feared the people would learn what they worshipped. Instead, Lyle did not publish this. In his official book, the Wexford Seminary received only a footnote. His silence, like that of others before him, became part of the archive itself. But traces surfaced despite the effort. In 1888, workmen digging foundations for a new mill house half a mile from the seminary unearthed bones. At first believed to be animal remains, closer inspection revealed human jaw fragments, small enough to belong to adolescents. The discovery was reported in the Manchester Guardian on 12th March 1888, but no follow-up ever appeared. The bones were said to be reburied in consecrated ground. Where exactly is not recorded. At the century's close, the seminary fire of 1894 was described in newspapers as an unfortunate accident of lightning. Yet in Wexford itself, older residents whispered a different story, that the fire began in the crypt, not the roof. One farmer claimed he saw light from below, long before flames reached the rafters. He swore the smoke carried not just heat, but voices, chanting faint and hollow. His account, written in a letter to his son, survives in private hands. By the dawn of the 20th century, the seminary was abandoned, its grounds fenced but never reclaimed. The diocese shifted attention to newer institutions. Wexford itself grew smaller, its young leaving for mills and factories in Manchester and Leeds. With each departure, fewer remained who remembered the old winter of terror. Yet memory clings in unexpected places. In 1906, a folklorist named Edith Rowe collected local superstitions. Among them, she recorded one still spoken in Wexford, that on All Hallows' Eve, the ruined seminary walls weep, and those who place an ear to the stone hear boys chanting in unison. Rowe, skeptical, dismissed it as invention, but her notebook preserves the phrasing, written exactly as told, "Pain is prayer." To this day, the ruin stands. Visitors rarely linger. Stones crumble, ivy thickens, but the symbol carved into the outer wall remains, the cross with two parallel lines, faint yet visible when winter sunlight falls sharp across the stone. No one in Wexford speaks of its meaning now. The village, reduced and quiet, prefers its silence. The well where the first boy was found is filled, the square repaved, the old parish records seldom consulted. But for those who know where to look, for those who read the letters, the ledgers, the forgotten reports, the story remains wound in the historical record. A seminary that taught not prayer, but torment. A doctrine written not in gospel, but in blood. And so the questions linger, unanswered yet persistent. Were the 6 novices of 1842 consumed in ritual? Did the priests believe they were shaping saints, or creating something else entirely? And why, across decades of silence, did no authority ever speak the truth aloud? The silence itself is an answer, though not the one Wexford would ever choose. If you wish to continue uncovering the forgotten truths buried in history's shadows, subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the world's darkest mysteries. For in silence, sometimes, lie the most terrifying stories of all.